Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Finding Humanity podcast webinar series. My name is Diana Galbraith, and I am an associate producer and researcher for the podcast. This webinar series will feature guests from season 1. Today's webinar is a conversation with our 2 executive producers. We will be sharing excerpts of our episodes as we go along. A little bit about our podcast. Through real-life stories of courage and purpose, Finding Humanity takes listeners into the heart of the most complex social and political issues facing our world today. Each episode puts a human face on a global topic that can be overwhelming and difficult to grasp, whether it's a refugee crisis, climate change, or LGBTQ rights. Our podcast weaves together insights from human rights and development experts at the United Nations and leading academic institutions while providing listeners with tangible calls to action to make a difference in the world. Here is the trailer from season 1.
I don't have the accent.
I am originally from Cambodia.
And I'm from Uganda.
I originally come from a Kurdish family from the city of Kobani in Aleppo.
And my family, they were in transit. They were leaving Yemen during a difficult time.
Day by day, we hear about the reality of the world we live in.
Detained in Libya, caught up in
Brazil,
a nightmare.
where wildfires in the Amazon continue to burn.
At a Walmart has led to multiple deaths.
Fourth year in a row, Category 5 storm in the Atlantic.
Growing social inequalities, human rights abuses, and the irreversible horrors of climate change, to name just a few.
I was 5 years old when the soldiers stormed into my native city of Phnom Penh. And for the next 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days, I would live under the Khmer's regime.
I woke up and I heard these loud explosions around me. It's these bombs that would just drop, and then after like 20 or 30 seconds, you just feel this gush of wind and energy push you back.
Global issues are often complex, overwhelming, and hard to understand. When we're bombarded with negative news and misinformation, it's easy to feel confused and powerless. From where you are, you think, I can't possibly make a difference.
People think that we flee because we want to. The truth is, we flee, if not for ourselves, then for our children, who deserve much better than living in constant fear and anxiety and having the fear of not being alive tomorrow. Fear is a very exhausting emotion.
This is Finding Humanity, a new podcast from the Humanity Lab Foundation and Human Group Media. And I'm your host, Hazami Barmada. I'm a human rights advocate and social impact specialist, and I'm the proud daughter of a Palestinian refugee. Through my years working with social justice activists from all over the world, many years spent at the United Nations, and through my own personal journey and the travesties that I have witnessed, I have come to know the power of the human spirit.
I have a cerebral palsy since birth, and I use a wheelchair. I'm not bound by it. The wheelchair is my car, and I'm very proud of it.
Each episode features a story of one resilient human, like Najeen Mustafa, a teenage refugee who endured a grueling 3,500-mile journey on a wheelchair to escape the war in Syria.
When the opportunity arose for me to go to Europe and Germany, I was ecstatic, even though I knew that the risks were high and that we actually could die during the crossing of the Mediterranean, but I was willing to take that chance.
Or humans like Victor Ochin, a Nobel Peace Prize nominee who fought for peace amidst the violent conflict in Uganda.
My brother was abducted in 2003 on the 10th of December, which is International Human Rights Day. So he's among many tens of thousands of children from northern Uganda who have taken by the rebels and they have never come back. How can I make sure that I'm the last generation of Africans who have lived that kind of horrors?
Through personal stories of courage and purpose, our podcast puts a human face on the most critical issues facing our world. Finding Humanity weaves in voices of humanitarians and global experts to help unpack the biggest problems of our time.
The U.S. war in Vietnam spread to Cambodia in the late 1960s when the Viet Cong started using Cambodia as a passageway for the Ho Chi Minh Trail to avoid American bombing.
Whether you're an activist, aspiring changemaker, or even consider yourself an everyday person who wants to learn more about global issues and how you can address them in your own way, our podcast was created for you. In each episode, you'll hear how our guests turned unspeakable pain into courage and adversity into an opportunity to create a positive change.
Years later, I would turn the pages of my journals into 3 memoirs. I am so grateful that so many people have supported my books. One of such person is a very wonderful actress named Angelina Jolie, who read my book when it first came out in 2000.
How is it that if they kill my people, it is wrong, and if I kill their people, it's right? I think what is wrong and what is right is right. Let me use the opportunity I have now. Maybe I use that as a platform to transform my trauma, my pain, my suffering into an opportunity for something new, something that I never lived, but something that I dreamt about, which was peace.
You are far from powerless. And through our podcast, we hope to educate and inspire you to take action, and together create a better world for all of us. Finding Humanity premieres in February.
And now I am pleased to introduce our host and co-executive producer, Hazami Barmada, who is also the founder and CEO of the Humanity Lab Foundation. I'm also pleased to introduce Camille Laurente, who is co-founder and CEO of Human Group Media and co-executive producer of our podcast. Let's begin with a question for Hazami. Hazami, what is the vision for the Finding Humanity podcast? How did it come into being? And what are some of your visions and goals for the podcast?
So thank you so much for hosting, Diana. It's been such a privilege to work with both you and Camille over the last years at this point. I think initially the vision for the podcast was really to find a way to tell really complicated stories and make them relatable to people. I'm half Syrian, half Palestinian, as you heard in the trailer. And one of the biggest challenges that I've faced through my life and my career is trying to explain to people why they should care about issues. And oftentimes when you dive into talking about them, their eyes just glaze over. Because how do you make sense and fathom the fact that we have, over 70 million refugees around the world, and that number is growing? 25,000 children die every single day under the age of 5 from preventable diseases, and the list goes on and on. And so for most people, when you talk about Libya and Yemen and genocide and transphobia and homophobia and all types of different things, that social ills, I would call them, that plague our world, it's really hard to grapple with. And a lot of times media and news, they excite the anger and the outrage in you to say, oh my God, this needs to end. But most people feel clueless as to how to even start when the problems are complex. And so one of the original things that I always used to say, I used to do communications for the UN. And one of the things that I used to talk about is that there's a big difference between making issues simplified versus making them simplistic. And there is a really big difference. How do you simplify a war in Syria, which is where my family lives? How do you simplify conflict and occupation that's taking place, for example, in the Palestinian territories or in different parts of the world? And so the idea behind the podcast was really not only to make these issues understandable, but to actually break them down into ways that are not overwhelming and actually answer some of the questions that a lot of people have. I get a lot of PMs on my social media after I post articles or advocacy pieces saying, well, how can I actually understand this better? Or what's actually happening? And people are ashamed to ask questions because we also live in a world of a lot of, stigma around uncertainty. We live in a world where there's a lot of, being politically correct and so on. And I think we'll get into more of this in the discussion later, but the podcast really aimed to be a place to tell these stories, to humanize the people in the stories. They're not victims. These are people that happen to be facing the consequences of the situation that they were either born into or fell into. And we really try to humanize their stories, to empower their narratives, and to elevate their advocacy onto a global stage.
Yeah, and I think what we're really doing is telling stories. And whenever you tell a story, that involves framing and how do we frame the issues. So, Camille, let me bring you in. You're with Human Group Media, of course, as CEO. How did you become involved in the podcast, and what parts of storytelling do you really like to focus on?
So yeah, I guess I'll start with a brief intro. And first and foremost, I'm really glad to be with Diana and Hazami today, this morning, and share a bit more about our work at Finding Humanity. So Human Group Media is a podcast company for social change. And what we specialize in is we work with nonprofits, nonprofit organizations, for-purpose companies, and thought leaders to tackle and amplify conversations around the most critical, sometimes really complex issues that our world is facing today. So whether that's gender inequality, racial injustice, mental health, the climate crisis, but also on some shows that we do, are really focused on some of the more niche causes that our partners or our clients are aligned with. And I met Hazami a couple of years ago because we featured her on our flagship podcast called Sincerely Human. And I got to know her incredible background in social impact work and her also, her involvement at the United Nations. And then I guess I'm speaking on behalf of Hazami, that we share this same passion for storytelling and also really the urgency and sort of this goal and mission to create a better world for humanity through the work that we do. And we've said this, since the inception of our company and Human Group Media, and getting to know more about Hazami, and now with our work at Finding Humanity, storytelling is a powerful tool for social change, and we could not emphasize or underscore that more. And we will be discussing that today in this webinar. And what I really love about it is it has this sheer power to humanize a certain topic or issue that is really so overwhelming and can sometimes or often, it can often be really foreign to our listeners. They can be so detached from an issue just because it's not happening in their own communities. So it's a supercharged tool, often underutilized, in media or in our daily lives, but it has the ability to convey emotions, build more empathy and trust among us as humans.
Completely. And I think our podcast is nice because it's multifaceted. So we're not just educating people around the world, we're providing space for people to tell their stories. We're putting a personal face on crises that otherwise just sort of look like big stories in the media. Question for Hazami. I know you had mentioned earlier that we want to lend agency to the people that we interview. It's not just about a couple of sound bites, it's really about someone's story. So how do we balance telling someone's story, but wanting to make sure that they have the dignity and the agency to have the space and tell their own story? So how do we maintain that balance?
And that's a really good question. And I think the fundamental thing for me is that we're actually giving them a space to tell their own story too. Because the reality is oftentimes we tokenize people, right? So we have one person speaking on behalf of all refugees, or a woman speaking on behalf of all women. And what we're trying to bust through is that everyone has their very unique human experience. And I think, again, back to kind of what you were talking about, Camille, what bonded us together, the Humanity Lab Foundation, our goal is to really unlock human potential to catalyze change. There's so many amazing people doing amazing things right now. We need to push past this narrative that we need to create change makers, and make more things happen. There are fantastic things happen that are being marginalized, overlooked, pushed to the side. There are so many minority voices that are speaking loud and clear that do not have platforms. And a lot of what we're trying to do through this is to elevate those stories, but also, to your point, Diana, of balancing. It is a balance between sensationalizing these stories and telling them in a journalistic way. We live in an era right now where what sells in the media, very sadly, is destruction and despair and doom and gloom. And for anyone interested, there's an amazing book called Words That Work. And it's a campaigning book that actually talks about the power of words in dictating whether people choose to take the extra step to take action or just care and leave it there or not care at all. And so words are powerful, and how we use them is a responsibility that we take. I mean, even at the Finding Humanity podcast, we go through our script so many times. We go through our sound bites. We go through every little bit, and we challenge each other, right? We ask, well, hold on, is this telling a biased story? Is this victimizing? Is this word triggering in some way? And so we try to really be careful with how we frame not only the stories themselves, but also how we choose to tell those stories. Because I always say it is a massive privilege that people trust us with such vulnerability. And our podcasts, I mean, hopefully everyone will listen to all of them, but our podcasts really do go into really vulnerable human experiences that allow people to not only connect with people, but and dehumanize and move past dehumanization of them, but also to really connect with their human experience, which all of us share. You know, the fear, desire for safety, desire to be wanted, feeling like you're not good enough, feeling like the world, is just unjust around you, feeling all types of things. These are issues that we deeply have. Sorry, my mom is coming to borrow my charger. Apologies. Welcome to COVID era. But that's a lot of what we try to do, on the podcast. And there is a balance there, because I think on our end with the Humanity Lab Foundation, and what I love about working with Human Group Media is we are an organization that works, with the United Nations, with global organizations to really get people to take action on tangible policy, social and economic issues. And so, that balance between, policy and economic change and financial change is super important. We're not just trying to inspire you. We're trying to inspire you to then figure out how to bust through the massive walls that are stopping us from actually eradicating poverty, stopping us from achieving gender equality, stopping us from recreating the horrors of the past. And that's kind of the balance we take in how we tell our stories.
So in essence, yes, we're a podcast, but we're also a call to action. We try to reach, beyond sort of the podcast model, which is so important because that's how we tell our story, but we're also trying to create tangible change in the world. And I think that's definitely hopefully one of the benefits that we offer. Speaking of script writing, as Hazami had mentioned, Camille, on the production end, how does the script writing process work for you? How do you begin? How do you know what to focus on?
So I guess I'll be a bit more tactical and strategic if there are storytellers and communicators, script writers who are tuned in. So for us, everything starts with our material, our audio recordings, our research on our guests, our research on our topics, which would go from, like some of them can go as far as or as long as 100 pages, because they are, again, as Hazami has mentioned, and probably Diana, these are very complex topics that, that have been sort of either some of them are misrepresented, some of them, there's a lot of information out there. So we really have to kind of sift through all of these material to make sure that it still sounds clear to our listener as we narrate and as we shape the narrative of our episode. And it starts with once we have these materials gathered, I would say it starts with listening to our raw recordings. So, a couple of hours of interviews. We have dozens of experts that have come on and have given us, their space and time to educate us and educate our audience on these topics. But for me personally, as a scriptwriter and even our team at Human Group Media, typically we would start with a specific moment, a challenge even, or something we believe is compelling in our main speaker story. So for example, if we're talking about Victor Ochin and peacekeeping and his experience in Uganda, then we might pick out a certain moment in his story and make sure that while that is compelling and thought-provoking, we want that the theme that he's discussing there or that moment to still be accessible Hazami mentioned earlier, sort of universal themes, experiences that you and I might share, right? So love for family, his love for his brother, which is, we have those experiences and we have those emotions. So I guess it starts from there and then it sort of unravels itself. And we make sure we insert, our experts' insights on subtopics and themes that we touch on.
And if I could jump in really quickly to Diana too, and the stage before that too is, I mean, you, Diana, are one of our heroes because you're out there finding the stories and finding the people and finding the experts. And the step before, even Camille's talking about, those hours and hours and hours of raw interviews, because there was a lot of raw interview. It's even the step before is we actually, from the Humanity Lab Foundation side, we actually come up with some themes that we really think are pressing issues around the world. So what's news talking about, and then what's news not talking about, and why? And that to me was fundamentally one of the core things I loved about starting this podcast is why are some stories not in the mainstream media? Why are there genocides that are happening? Even as we speak today, there are mass human rights violations that just do not seem to make media. And that's a lot of what we do talk about, even with our experts, is why are these things not on people's minds? Why are they being silenced? And we talk, for example, about the Uyghur community in China, which is more in season 2, but the Muslim majority community there, and it's not, in the media. So why is there not more outrage? Why are there was not more outrage on various other issues? And so what we do is we come up with a framing of that initially. And then Diana, you go out and you find amazing primary speakers that we can feature the story of. And what we do is we sift through, is this person's story telling a whole picture? Is this person actually connected to the cause versus speaking on behalf of other communities? And even with the experts, I mean, there are bunches and bunches of experts in the world. We intentionally pick the experts that really do a good job of being non-biased to the extent that you can be. And I think that will come up in our conversation, but we really want people that tell the experts, in essence, that really help you understand the issue without the sensationalization. So it's what policies exist, what issues exist, like what is actually happening without the narration. We come in and we narrate, right? That's the podcast. The goal of the podcast is to help that make sense. But we want raw, deep, hardcore information. And Camille and her team have an amazingly hard job of actually sifting through and saying, okay, how can we preserve the integrity of the goal of this initial episode while telling these stories and not sensationalize? And I think, if I could add that part onto it, I think, there's an arc. And then after that script writing is done, we also go back and fact check. Did we frame this correctly? Did we tell the right statistics? Do we use the right sound bites? Is this skewing the narrative? So there is quite a long production process, and that's something that I am very proud of. And I think I'm speaking on behalf of Camille and I and our entire teams. We're so proud of the journalistic integrity that we do take in making these happen, because we have enough false narratives in the world. We're living in a world of misinformation, fake news, if I could use that. I hate that frame, but it's important to tell these stories right.
Completely. And speaking of telling stories, let's hear an excerpt from activist Cherner Baugh's episode.
Frankly, I've always been a bit of a noisemaker, just always been rattled by a sense of injustice.
Child marriage is one of the biggest factors that leads girls to drop out of school. And this is most the case in sub-Saharan Africa, which has the highest prevalence of child marriage.
Sierra Leone is best known, unfortunately, for the decade-long civil war that has been kind of immortalized in Hollywood films. And as a result, Sierra Leone's had a really tough time shaking the image of child soldiers and terrible abuses against the civilian population. Now, it's also been one of the most successful peace-building stories in Africa.
You have to imagine possible. You have to imagine different. You have to hold on to that. It's the most important thing we guard is hope, the belief that things can and will be better.
One of the features of Finding Humanity is our partnership with the Elders. The Elders is a group of world leaders who work on a number of social justice issues, just as we do. Hazami, can you talk a bit about the partnership that we have with the elders? Why is it important to be interviewing world leaders at this point in time?
Well, I think, the elders, and kudos to the amazing team at the elders, and shout out to Laura and Luke, who have been our partners in benevolence, not partners in crime, but benevolence. But I think the partnership with the elders is really critical. So the elders, for those who don't know, is an organization that was founded by Nelson Mandela in 2007, which brings together, in essence, former world leaders, prime ministers, Nobel Peace Prize laureates, human rights, defenders and champions together to really think about and talk about and urge action on critical global issues. So our agendas align a lot. And I've been, really proud that the Humanity Lab Foundation has been partners with the elders for some time. And so when they expressed, interest in partnering around the podcast, it was very exciting for us in Human Group Media, in our teams, because it actually took our podcast to a level of, and I don't want to say stepped it up, because we already have fantastic speakers from leading global organizations all around the world. But it did also kind of help bring in the policy angle to the conversation. It's not enough to just have human rights activists and policy organizations speaking about these issues, but we want to understand, why is this not happening? Why is the UN failing to take action? Why are global treaties failing? What policies and laws and things exist that are hindering progress? And so the elders bring not only that expertise and that passion, but they also have the credibility to have these conversations at a level that I think adds a lot of nuance and nuanced thinking, number one, but also a lot of power behind the importance of world leaders stepping up. We don't want, each of our episodes ends with a call to action, and we don't want to put the burden and the responsibility of change on the backs of those that are already social justice champions, because we are all in this together. And that's kind of the point of our podcast. So we need businesses to do more. We need governments to do more. We need civil society to do more. We do need people to do more, because we have more agency as individuals living around the world than we realize. And we do bring that up in our episodes. But the reality is governments need to do more. We need better laws. We need better policies. And so the elders bring not only that expertise, but also that passion, because these are a lot of world leaders who've been there, who've struggled with passing policies that are proactive and positive, and they explain to us why. And so a lot of our podcasts, I always like to say that we like to inspire thought leadership. We're not a podcast that tells you what to think, but it helps you think more about how to think about solution-based thinking on critical global issues. We aim to spark that intellectual curiosity, that social justice part in each and every one of us, and we can each do something. And so the elders really bring a level of depth to that.
And also, if I may add to Hazami's point, what the elders and special episodes that we have, if any of our anyone who's tuned in has listened to our special episodes with the special edition episodes with the elders, is that we talk about accountability. We talk about leadership from a government standpoint, as Hazami mentioned. And because of their credibility and what the organization stands for, we have the space to do that. Because if you go through our episodes, our regular episodes, we do a lot of storytelling, right? But again, with our partnership with the elders, we kind of are doing a 360, a kind of a view of the entire picture. Right. So we tackle and we talk to each actor. So the individual, we talk to the nonprofit leader, we talk to the grassroots movement builder, but we also talk to people in positions of power. So I think that's what's really special about that partnership.
And let's, Hazami, let's hear an excerpt from one of our elders episodes, please.
Frankly, I've always
This pandemic is demonstrating how important it is to follow the scientific evidence.
Here we are, lifeboat Earth, where the Earth is almost in its own ICU, and it's not force majeure. People are responsible for this.
The importance of civil society is absolutely crucial now and in the future.
To explore today's most pressing global issues, we're proud to launch a new special series of the Finding Humanity podcast with the Elders, a group of global leaders brought together by Nelson Mandela in 2007. I'm your host, Hazami Barmada.
And I'm Mary Robinson, Chair of the Elders and co-host of the show. From pandemics to climate change and nuclear weapons, it will take all of humanity to meet these challenges. Be part of the solution. Join us on the Finding Humanity podcast.
Camille, we live in a soundbite culture where so often we only get little clips here and there of what someone is talking about. When it comes to telling the story of one of our guests, how do you know which excerpts of an interview to include? And then how much do we use as our general narration?
So that's a real challenge, and that's an everyday challenge for us as we work on our episodes. We do a painstaking, it's a painstaking amount of work to go through the raw interviews and pull excerpts that we believe should make the cut or should be in the final episode. I would say, again, from a very process oriented response, we do at least a couple of rounds of listening to these interviews. If our guests were able to directly and succinctly respond to a question or a topic that we believe should be included in the podcast, then that definitely, there's a high chance that would make it into the episode. But if, sometimes our guests might not be able to, explain their thoughts clearly or as succinctly as we'd hope, then that might be the job of our host, to narrate. So we kind of, do it as we go. But what we want to make sure that we want to ensure is that when there are these very raw, very emotional moments of our and we want to maintain their truth and the integrity of their story. And so that definitely is something that we look out for, and we want to make sure that that's what our listeners get to hear.
And if I can just jump into that too,
Yes.
I think one of the things that we do really well in our partnership too is I'll read, with I want to definitely mention Martina and some of our kind of team, Aisha and Carolina, on more of the research and kind of policy side of the team. What we'll do is we'll read through and we'll say, does this make sense? What is missing? And we'll also suggest edits back to Camille and the team at Human Group Media to say, hold on, this doesn't make sense. Because the reality is, for some of these complex issues, most of us that are on the production side of this podcast understand these issues, but our audience doesn't. So when we're talking about, for example, UN reforms or, things along those lines, what we'll do is say, does this make sense to your average person? And if not, how do we explain it in a way that does make sense? And so we'll go back and forth. And even with some of the sound bites, like just making sure, okay, well, this might be telling a misleading story, or maybe this needs a bit more context. And so we'll come through with some of the sound bites to explain parts that we feel like can't just be left alone, and we need to carry someone through that storyline. And so it is a balance of kind of on our side too, just making sure that the explanation of what's actually happening is included. And that's where the narration that I do does come in, is to help provide that context. But again, it is a push and pull, because sometimes Camille and the team are like, well, that's too much information, don't overwhelm. And so there is that nice balance. And that's what I think works really well with production for anyone who's also watching that's interested in storytelling. Find people that also complement your skill sets, but also challenge them. Because, Camille and her team are amazing storytellers and podcast producers. And they do a fantastic job with making these sound fantastic. Our team skills are really around policy and human rights advocacy and accountability, and a lot more of the kind of the engagement around the why of the podcast too. And so it becomes a really healthy push and pull on, what information do we need to include and for what purpose. And we have had extensive debates and dialogues around some of these issues. So just to let you guys know, it's not an easy process, especially if you want to do it correctly. So many times I think people just gloss over this process and they're like, oh, that makes sense. But who does it make sense to? And because we have such a massive global audience, we actually reach, Camille, it's how many countries?
I believe.
How many, sorry?
Over 40.
Yeah, and we, very excitedly, we're also ranked among the top podcasts on documentary style podcast. We put a lot of effort and emphasis into making sure that we're historically accurate. Even questions like how far back in history do we go? And that's really important. I just want to touch on this, Diana, and I'll hand back over to you. Apologies for taking time on this, but it is important to me, from being from a part of the world that's riddled with conflict, to not make it seem like the onus of conflict is on the people living in these communities. We cannot talk about the Middle East, and this is an issue I am very passionate about, without looking at the colonization, the imperialism, and the injustices and the wars that have been inflicted on innocent civilians in the region. So it's so easy to look at the war in Syria or refugees and say, oh, well, let's talk about the refugee crisis. But we need to explain, why is there even a refugee crisis to begin with? And quite frankly, the crisis is not the refugees. It's the policies and the wars that are creating refugees. And so all of that is incorporated into how we tell our stories. In the Yemen episode, we also go into the history of colonialization and divide and conquer. We talk about that in several of our Africa episodes, because when you look at vacuums of power and political instability, it's so easy to say, why can't these people in the sub-Saharan Africa and on the continent get this together? Why is the Middle East falling apart? We talk about Pakistan. We have, episodes on Afghanistan. And it's really important for people to understand, how did we get here? And in order to understand where we go from here, we have to understand how we got here. And so many times storytelling is done from the present into the future. And we think it's really important to include the past in the script.
So it's context, it's history, it's political factors. It's really the whole picture in which we situate our stories. Let's listen to an excerpt of Abby Stein's episode. Abby Stein grew up transgender in a conservative religious community in New York.
Here's Abby.
People ask me, oh, when did you realize that you identify as a girl? And I'm like, that's the wrong question. Because I never realized I'm identifying as a girl. My realization was that everyone around me thinks that I'm a boy.
When people come out within their Jewish community, wherever that Jewish community falls along Jewish denominational lines or political lines, it is very common still for people not to feel a full sense of belonging.
In 69 countries in the world at the moment, same-sex conduct, same-sex activity is still illegal in the world today. A lot of trans people get caught up in the criminalization of same-sex activity.
In some twisted way, the silver lining of growing up in such a gender-segregated society is that it was very clear to me which side of the wall that separates man and woman, which side I belong at.
Question for both of you, actually. Storytelling is only one form of communication. And since you both work in the media and communications field, how does storytelling differ from other forms of communication? How is what we're doing different from or similar to journalism, for example?
Hazami, would you like to start? I guess just very briefly, because we did touch on storytelling quite a bit. Storytelling, there's human connection that we're able to build. If we do a story right, and if we do our job with all the sort of pre-production work, all of the research that goes into it, finding the right speakers, and then weaving that into a narrative or weaving that into a story, then I would say it's one of the most powerful tools we have. It's one of the most effective communications tools we have. And I think, again, I mentioned this earlier, it's very underutilized because stories actually can create movements. We've heard this time and time again. A personal, experience when that is shared through different forms of media, can actually get people to think about a specific issue that they might not have thought about in the past, or they might gloss over it because they just happen to scroll over it on social media, Instagram, LinkedIn, or wherever it is that that whatever social media platform they use. But storytelling enables us to dig deeper. It enables us to talk human to human, which other forms of communications might not be able to do.
Yeah, and I think, prior to starting the Humanity Lab Foundation, I was working at the UN doing global communications for several offices, including the Secretary General's Envoy on Youth, where I led global engagement for young people around the world, which was 1.8 billion, no small feat. But the challenge that we had was that, again, oftentimes we talked about sound bites. You asked that earlier, Diana. To Camille's point, that soundbite culture also works because not soundbite culture, storytelling also works because it's relatable to people, right? People don't want to feel overwhelmed by these issues. So when you hear a story, it's, human history has been based on storytelling. We all come from lineages where stories are told and they're passed on, and you're more comfortable with the format of storytelling. The challenge, again, and I referenced my job and sound bites in my previous job, even including the World Humanitarian Summit, where I was coordinator of the UN Secretary General's World Humanitarian Summit. Our challenge was, how do you start to engage a global ecosystem around conversations on super complex humanitarian, social, human rights issues, especially because most of the research that was actually being produced are going into these 150-page reports. They're so dense and so complicated and so hard to understand. So you have a lot of think tanks that are producing amazing content. You have a lot of organizations that are doing super important research and statistics work that actually backends, and we pull a lot of that into our podcast in the research process. We actually dig through these research reports. We pull out statistics, we pull out data, we pull out facts from these. And so we leverage, and we have a lot of these reports, and we are launching, and we will be launching in the very near future, toolkits, education toolkits for every single one of our episodes, which actually references these reports and allows you as an audience to deep dive into these issues with more depth if you're curious to learn more about the advocacy. But there's a time and a place for everything. And I think storytelling is one component, but there are times where you have to hit hard with advocacy communication. And advocacy communication is bold, it's urgent, it's now. We have to take action. People are suffering. And then you also have to mix that with the credibility of the statistics and the data and all of that. And I think, again, the different outputs that we're creating with the podcast tries to incorporate that as much as possible. But there is still a really important role for journalism. And I really hope that we get back into an era where journalism is not about hype, but actually about informing communities on things they should care about. Because unfortunately, every time I turn on my TV, and I will not reference channels, I watch the same breaking news story for literally 40 hours. And it's breaking news. And quite frankly, I'm sitting here saying the world is there's so much stuff happening around the world. Why is that never breaking news? So I think we have to really think about media, mainstream media. We need to think about writing. We need to think about storytelling, podcasting, social media, integrated. If we can start to figure out how to leverage the power of each of these, they reach people differently and they have a different purpose. There's not a one shoe fits all for communicating, especially on critical issues. And so again, a big part of what we try to do is we do try to sift through all of it. Again, we include sound bites of hard punching reports. We include information, from really critical things that no one is reading. There are so many reports that are sitting there collecting dust, on archives of the United Nations or Human Rights Watch and so on and so forth. And we try to make those relevant. We include the experts who write the reports and the researchers because their voices do matter. And oftentimes they're not getting the airwaves to actually talk to these issues.
I like the term advocacy communication. That's really interesting, Hazami. Next up, let's listen to an excerpt from our guest, Nujeen Mustafa. Nujeen is a woman who traveled from Syria to Germany in a wheelchair. Here she is.
I tried to learn something new every day and tried to fight the stigma that surrounded a person with disability, because I knew nobody expected that I would achieve anything. So I tried to prove everyone wrong.
Protests began in Syria in March 2011 in the context of the broader wave of mass protests that swept across much of the Arab world.
Women and girls with disabilities in particular, globally, face greater risk of gender-based violence.
Please do not let anyone discourage you from being passionate about whatever you find as your purpose or cause.
And to those of you in the audience, feel free to ping us some of your questions so we can get your voices involved as well. Another question for both of you. In journalism, we talk about being unbiased, and we're telling stories. We're also including facts and background on the Finding Humanity podcast. Are we trying to be unbiased? What does that look like in our project?
I guess I can start. I mean, we do have to be unbiased. There has to be that element. Personally, and the entire team, I'm speaking on behalf of the team, we do need to set aside personal convictions, our personal opinions on certain issues, because what we want to do, aside from tell these compelling stories, is arm our audience with knowledge, right? And that has to be fact-checked, that has to be well-researched, and not sort of influenced by our own, our history, our past, what we're involved in. This is why we have academics, we have researchers, people who have been on the field to give us the information our audience needs in order to act on the issues that we're exploring on the podcast.
And I would say that too. It's so hard for me because I'm someone who was, grew up to a Palestinian refugee mother who grew up, my family's displaced, from the war in Syria. And I grew up in the Middle East myself. I'm a migrant to the United States. So when I read some of these stories and I talk about them, there's that deep, just passion. And I say, and I started being much more public, even on social media, about how hard it is to tell these stories. There are numerous times that I weep through my interviews. And the reality is it's because I feel that human connection so deeply and that raw emotion. And so the fact of unbiased is, I don't think there's a way to be fully unbiased, but I think we can try our hardest to recognize and call out the bias when we see it. And again, that's why I mentioned earlier, having a team of people that challenge you and may have different backgrounds and perspectives is super important. But then we also have conviction of telling stories, and we're not afraid to be bold. We're unapologetic about telling the truth as it is, backed by data, backed by facts, backed by reports, backed by tons of research. Our research reports to prepare for every single episode are about 25 pages long of all types of reports on different sides of all the opinions. So we look at the pros and the cons and the disagreements and all of these things. And so I think one of the important things that we try to do is we try to look at even conspiracy theories. We look at, why do people think climate change is a hoax? We want to understand why people believe these things, because we cannot change public opinions on human rights issues without understanding why we are in the place we are today. Why are there climate deniers? Why are there people that will justify human rights violations for economic gain, and so on and so forth? And so to be knowledgeable and to tell these stories in the most unbiased way possible, we have to incorporate that. And we do sometimes incorporate those into our scripts. So if you listen to some of our podcasts, you'll hear that we actually talk about, well, this is disputed, or maybe there's tension around this issue. We call it out when it is. And we also, for example, don't pretend to be experts on all the issues. There is no pretending in our podcast. There are times when we say, we're not going to go into the depth and the background of this issue. You can learn about it more in our toolkits and other material, but the podcast is focusing on this specific angle. And again, that's part of the integrity of storytelling that I think a lot of people don't do, is they will tell you one glimpse of a story and completely leave out the massive context that surrounds it. And I think that is lack of integrity in storytelling, especially when you're telling stories like these. Another thing, for example, Najeen corrected me. You guys just heard her excerpt. I asked her, what does it feel like to be bound on a wheelchair? And she said to me, what does it feel like to be bound by your legs? And I sat there, and it could have taken that as a moment to say, oh my God, what a horrible question. And I asked her, and actually Camille included that in the podcast, and so, we keep these things in there. We learn there. It is so hard to be politically correct. The episode I did with Abby Stein, you guys heard the excerpt. She's a trans, rabbi from New York City, from a Hasidic Jewish community, and I asked what most people would consider dumb questions, like, is it offensive to say this? Is it offensive to say that? And we included a lot of that in the interview itself, because it is very challenging for us to have conversations around critical issues when everyone's afraid of saying the wrong thing. And we do live in a society of shame and calling people out and cancel culture and all those things. So people are pulling back, and they're retreating, and they're so afraid. And so we're trying to create these compassionate spaces for people to learn through our storytelling. And I think that that's an important part. So it's not that you can be fully unbiased, but I think recognizing where you could potentially have biases is important. And I'll make one note. I know we're running short on time. We have an upcoming season, which I know Diana is going to announce. We have 2 episodes that we did, one on PTSD and one on violent extremism, including white nationalism. And we recorded these prior to what happened in the United States on the 6th of January. And one of the things that I said to the team, I kept going back, and it haunted me after the interviews, is we need to talk about toxic masculinity and misogyny, which did not come up in any of the interviews. And why is it that these 2 white men specifically, were able to flip their lives and then go into a place of now being advocates for the opposite of what they did, right? So, one is an anti-war advocate, and the other now is a peace advocate. And I'm sitting here saying, well, if that had been a person of color, if that had been someone from another community, would they have had the ability to now be making money off of books and so on and so forth? And this is not to talk ill of them. It's a learning process that we went through as a team to say, what expert voices do we now need to bring in? Because that just sat with me in a way that was just very uncomfortable. So again, having those thought partnerships in our team to be able to come back and say, hold on, let's talk about toxic masculinity that creates it. And it's not about creating it's not about creating sympathy with them. It's about creating empathy in what creates this culture that enables toxic masculinity to happen. And so again, it's the nuance of how you choose to frame it, and it's the compassion that you have in the storytelling process.
Camille, did you want to add anything about not bringing our own bias into storytelling? I think we have a question from Bobby here from the audience.
No, I think, Hazami said it perfectly. We do check ourselves almost every step of the way. So from building our questions, from the framing to what goes on in the interview, we do need to kind of huddle and talk amongst ourselves, and even step back and think, are these questions, will we get the answers that a lot of people don't know, or are these questions sort of just catering to our own needs and desires to learn about something or to push a certain agenda, which we don't. But then, if you come into that sort of battle, then, we have so much processes before a story goes into an episode. And so there's it's a regular kind of practice that we have to do.
Before we wrap up, everyone, let's do one more excerpt from our episode with former President of Ireland, Mary Robinson.
One of the really troublesome things about a very troublesome crisis of COVID is that it exacerbates the intersectionality between poverty, gender, race, marginalization, being an Indigenous person, being a person with disability, all of this.
This crisis, it's not an unforeseeable accident. It was always known that a pandemic would come. What was not known, where the probability lay, was on the timing of it. And here we are, lifeboat Earth, where the Earth is almost in its own ICU. And it's not that it just happens. It's not force majeure.
We haven't lost our instinct for human rights. We're just in a very bad and bumpy time. We've got to come out of that.
The archetype of how good is qualified is if you care for everyone. You defend the rights of everyone.
Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. A couple of notes about our upcoming season 2. On Wednesday, we are releasing our first episode with the elders, featuring former President of Ireland, Mary Robinson, former President of Colombia and Nobel laureate Juan Manuel Santos. Our first regular episode for season 2 is released on February 3rd, where we interview Washington Post journalist Jason Rezaian about his experience being imprisoned in Iran. Please go to findinghumanitypodcast.com to learn about more of our work and have access to our episodes. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Until next time, see you online, and thank you so much.
Just Diana, I wanted to just really quickly, I know we had a question from Hannah. Since we have a minute or so, can we get to that?
Yes, of course.
No worries. So Hannah asked a question, and I want to make sure that we get that as we're wrapping up, around the metrics that we use to elevate to measure success of a story. And so obviously, I mean, Hannah and Camille could speak more to the success kind of in the metrics. So we were ranked in the top 30 podcasts for documentary style podcasts. We also have a lot of distribution from different communities and audiences, but it's also the quality of distribution. For us, it's not just about numbers, but it's also about who is sharing our content. So on social media, we get shared by quite a few, policymakers, high-level thought leaders, and so on and so forth. And so for us, that matters. As I mentioned, there's a lot of offline engagement, not offline, but off the podcast engagement that we also measure as metrics for success. It's where are these conversations going and what do they inspire? And so we are launching as of now education toolkits for every single episode. So they're about 20 pages long. They have discussion questions. They have a deep dive into the history, the context, a lot of the research, again, that we use in shaping each podcast that doesn't make it into the podcast because it's also very deep. We have them coming out on every issue, including racial inequality, looking at the history of slavery. What does bias mean? What is genocide? How do you pursue and hold accountable perpetrators of genocide, and so on? And so we also look at that as a measure of impact. We initially came up with our entire concept for the podcast and its distribution through universities prior to COVID. Due to COVID, we had to course correct and change our approach, because our initial approach was to actually utilize these podcasts and education toolkits as education curriculum in universities around the world, specifically, policy universities, master's programs in international affairs, and so on. And we'd created inroads with a lot of universities that were really interested in using our podcast as kind of part of their curriculum. And so we're still going to pursue that as an option. And we hope that anyone listening, if you're interested in taking this podcast and our content to your communities, please do reach out. But again, our goal, as I said earlier, is to really inspire the intellectual curiosity and the human rights advocate in every single one of us. And even if it's sharing it, even if it's getting some information and sharing it and correcting someone when they make a statement like, oh, refugees don't deserve this or that, that's success for us. So unfortunately, there's parts of the success we cannot measure, and we try to follow that in more of the non-traditional ways of kind of keeping up with the impact and the ripple effect of the podcast. But there is also hard data, and from the hard data, we're super proud of the fact that we got ranked, as a high ranking podcast, but then also our distribution. 40 plus countries around the world are consumers of our podcast. That for us is success also.
And just quickly to add to what Hazami said, something that might not be quantifiable. So aside from the reach and the downloads and all of those statistics, the increased interest from partners, which have much larger resources, have a much larger distribution, just by hearing and learning about the episodes and the quality of the podcast and what our mission is as an organization, as a team. Is success. From them hearing one episode, for example, about gender inequality in season 1, we would now have a partner that is fully engaged and wants to, create more awareness around a topic that is also related to, gender inequality, probably gender-based violence or any of that sort. So for us, that's a measure of success. And I guess just to wrap up, yes, we encourage everybody to sort of open their hearts and their minds and tune into the show. But also we would like for this to be a gateway for them, to arm themselves with more knowledge but also this is a way for us to encourage our audience to dig deeper. So find other resources. Once you've listened to the podcast, there is so much that we discuss. We're not able to cover that in 35 to 45 minutes. But we do speak to our listeners kind of on a very human level. And hopefully, they take us on their journey as they try to learn and educate themselves more.
And I don't think it's a coincidence that our podcast has the word human, Human Group Media has the word human, and Finding Humanity, the Humanity Lab Foundation has the word human. So, but before you wrap up, Diana, I just want to thank you for hosting and for your incredible work on helping make the podcast what it is today too.
All right, ladies, thank you so much for joining us today. To our audience, thank you for joining, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.